A young woman, cruelly cast out by her own family, with only her frail grandmother and a lame horse, thought her life was over. But what they discovered in the desolate wilderness would change their destinies forever. If you want to witness their incredible journey from despair to triumph, subscribe now. Tell us which city you are listening from today. Now let's begin. The heavy oak door slammed shut with a sound like a clap of thunder, a final brutal punctuation mark on a lifetime of memories. The reverberation shivered through the very bones of the house that was no longer hers. Elena stood on the dusty porch, the dry afternoon wind whipping strands of dark hair across her face, stinging her eyes. In her left hand, she clutched a worn leather lead rope. At the other end of it stood Sul, a horse as old as her own grief, his head hanging low, one leg bent at a painful angle. Her inheritance. A cruel joke. Her two uncles, Luis and Jorge, stood on the other side of the door, their faces visible for a moment through the glass pane. Luis's expression was one of triumphant, icy contempt. His eyes, small and hard like pebbles, held no trace of familial warmth, only a chilling greed. Jorge, the younger brother, stood behind him, his gaze averted, a weak man drowning in his brother's shadow. He couldn't meet her eyes. He couldn't bear to witness the finality of their betrayal. "This is it, then?" Elena whispered, her voice a dry rasp. The words were swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape that stretched out before her. A dirt road, a few wilting trees, and beyond that, the sprawling, empty desert of New Mexico. Beside her, her grandmother Anna stood with a ramrod-straight dignity that defied her 80 years and the tremor in her hands. She clutched a single battered cardboard suitcase containing all that remained of their lives. "They are not men, Elena," Anna said, her voice thin but clear, sharp as a shard of glass. "They are vultures waiting for the body to grow cold. Your mother, Sophia, she knew. She always knew what they were." Elena's heart clenched at the mention of her mother. It had been only 6 months since she had buried her, 6 months since the light had gone out of her world. Her mother had been the glue that held their small family together, a buffer against the simmering resentment of her two brothers. With her gone, the dam had broken. Luis had produced papers, official-looking documents with stamps and signatures that he claimed gave him ownership of the house. Their grandfather, Arturo's house. He said their mother had signed it over to him years ago to settle a debt. A lie. A monstrous, suffocating lie. Elena knew her mother would never have done that. Not this house. This house was their history, their sanctuary. "You can't do this," Elena had screamed, her voice raw with disbelief and pain. "This is our home. This was Grandpa Arturo's home." Luis had just laughed, a cruel, grating sound. "Was," he had sneered, plucking the documents from her grasp. "Past tense, little brat. It's my house now, and I don't want you or that useless old woman in it." He had gestured with his chin toward Anna. "And you can take that worthless creature with you," he added, his lip curling as he looked at Sul, the old horse dozing in the paddock. "Your mother's sentimental garbage." Sul had been her mother's horse, a gentle giant in his youth, now a frail relic. He was lame, arthritic, and utterly dependent. He was a burden. And that was the point of Luis's parting gift. It was not an inheritance, it was an anchor, meant to drag them down, to make their desperate situation impossible. Now, standing outside the slammed door, a cold rage began to burn through Elena's shock. It was a clean, sharp anger that pushed back the fog of despair. She looked at her grandmother, whose face was a mask of sorrow, but whose eyes held a flicker of steel. She looked at Sul, who shifted his weight and nudged her hand with his soft nose, as if to offer what little comfort he could. She would not beg. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She remembered her mother's words from years ago, a quiet warning whispered one evening. "Be careful of your uncles, Elena. Their hearts are full of stones." Her mother had been right. "Come, abuela," Elena said, her voice firmer now. She looped her arm through her grandmother's. "Let's go." "Go where?" Anna asked, her voice trembling for the first time. The question hung in the air, vast and terrifying. Elena had no answer. She only knew they could not stay here, a spectacle of pity for the neighbors who were likely already peering through their curtains. With her grandmother on one arm and the lead rope to a lame horse in the other, Elena turned her back on the only home she had ever known. They began to walk, a tiny, tragic procession, moving down the long dirt road that led to the highway, and to nowhere at all. The leaden-gray sky overhead seemed to press down on them, promising a cold night. Each step away from the house felt like a tear in the fabric of her soul, but with each step, a tiny, hard seed of resolve began to form in her heart. They had taken her home, but they would not take her spirit. The highway stretched before them like a long gray ribbon of despair, shimmering in the heat that radiated from the asphalt. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky, beating down on the three of them, a young woman, an old woman, and a lame horse. Cars and trucks roared past, metallic beasts that paid them no mind, their slipstreams buffeting them with hot exhaust-fumed air. Hope was a word their hearts no longer remembered. Elena's arm ached from the unaccustomed weight of the cardboard suitcase. Her other hand held firmly to Sol's lead rope. The old horse plodded along with a grim determination, his rhythmic limp a sad percussion to their journey. Every few steps he would stumble, and Elena's heart would lurch with fear. He was all they had left of her mother, a living, breathing link to a happier past. She could not lose him, too. The dust kicked up by the passing traffic coated their clothes and faces, a gritty film that got into their mouths and eyes. The desert landscape was vast and hostile, filled with thorny cacti and skeletal shrubs that offered no shade, no comfort. It was a world of sharp edges and brutal sunlight, a perfect reflection of the cruelty they had just endured. After what felt like an eternity, Anna stumbled. I need to rest, mija," she gasped, her face pale, her breath coming in shallow pants. Guilt washed over Elena. She had been so lost in her own storm of anger and fear that she hadn't been paying close enough attention to her grandmother. They found a small, dusty patch of ground a few yards off the road, next to a withered mesquite tree that provided a sliver of shade. Elena carefully helped Anna sit down, her fragile bones seeming to protest with every movement. Sul stopped gratefully, his head drooping almost to the ground. As Anna closed her eyes, trying to regain her strength, Elena's mind drifted, pulled back into the vortex of another betrayal, another abandonment. The memory was as sharp and painful as a fresh wound. It had happened less than a year ago, in a brightly lit cafe that had suddenly felt like a cold, sterile operating room. She was sitting across from Marco. His handsome face, which she had once thought was the kindest in the world, was tight with a kind of panicked revulsion. She had just told him she was pregnant. She had expected surprise, maybe even a little fear, but she had also, foolishly, expected love. She had expected him to take her hand and say they would figure it out together. Instead, he had leaned back, creating a chasm between them. "A baby," he'd said, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. He looked around the cafe, as if worried someone might overhear, as if she had just confessed to a crime. "Marco, we can do this," she had pleaded, her voice small. His response had been swift and surgical. "No, Elena, you can do this. That is your problem, not mine." He stood up, fumbling in his pocket for his wallet and tossing a $20 bill onto the table. It was an insult, a payment for services rendered. "It was a mistake," he'd said, his voice flat and final. "We were a mistake." And then he had walked away, leaving her sitting there with his cold words echoing in the ruins of her future. The baby had not survived. A few months later, stress and heartbreak had led to a miscarriage, a silent, private grief that she had shared only with her mother. It was another loss, another piece of her heart carved out and thrown away. First Marco, then the baby, then her mother, and now her home. It felt as if the world was systematically stripping her of everything she had ever loved. A soft, dry hand on her arm pulled her back to the present. Anna's eyes were open, and they were filled with a deep, knowing sorrow. It was as if she could see the ghosts that haunted her granddaughter's thoughts. "Do not let the hate consume you, Elena," Anna said softly, her voice gaining a surprising strength. "Hate is a poison that you drink, expecting the other person to die. Your uncles, that boy. They are not worth the space they occupy in your heart. We must look forward, only forward." Elena nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Her grandmother was right. Wallowing in the past would do them no good. It would only chain them to the very spot where they now sat, defeated and alone. They had to keep moving. They rested for a few more minutes, sharing the last of the water from a bottle Elena had managed to grab before the door was slammed in her face. Then, with a collective sigh of resolve, they rose to their feet. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, a beautiful, mocking spectacle. Night would be upon them soon, and with it, a new kind of fear. As they resumed their slow trek along the shoulder of the highway, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing steadily brighter. A glimmer of hope, fragile and desperate, sparked in Elena's chest. Maybe someone would stop. Maybe someone would help. She stepped closer to the road, ready to wave, to signal their distress. The pickup truck, an old rusted Ford, slowed as it approached. The driver, a silhouette against the setting sun, seemed to look right at them. But then, with a sudden cruel acceleration, the truck sped past, its tires kicking up a thick cloud of dust and gravel that engulfed them completely. They were left choking and spluttering, their brief flicker of hope extinguished and ground into the dirt. The driver's laughter seemed to hang in the air for a moment, a final twist of the knife. Despair, cold and heavy, settled over Elena once more. They were truly alone. But just as the last of the light was fading, as she was about to suggest they simply lie down and give up, her eyes caught something in the distance, set back from the road, almost perfectly camouflaged by the dusky light and a thicket of dry brush, was a shape. A solid, geometric shape against the organic chaos of the desert. A roof line. It was a house. An old adobe structure sitting alone in the vast emptiness, looking as forgotten as they were. Fear prickled at her skin. Who would live out here? But the alternative, spending a night exposed to the elements and whatever else lurked in the darkness, was far worse. "Abuela, look," she said, pointing with a trembling finger. Anna squinted, following her gaze. "A house," she breathed, A decision had to be made. With no other options, Elena gently tugged on Sewell's rope, turning him off the highway and onto the rough, uneven ground. The old horse seemed to understand. He lifted his head, a flicker of interest in his tired eyes, and began to move toward the silhouette, his limp gait surprisingly steady. It was as if he knew the way. It was as if he were leading them home. The path to the house was not a path at all, but a faint, overgrown track that suggested no one had traveled it for a very long time. The air grew still and quiet as they moved away from the highway, the roar of traffic fading into a distant hum. The only sounds were the crunch of their feet on the dry earth, the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush, and the soft, rhythmic puffing of Sewell's breath. As they drew closer, the house took on a more solid form. It was a simple, single-story, adobe building, its earthen walls cracked and weathered by decades of sun and wind. The windows were dark, empty eyes, and a few tiles were missing from the terracotta roof. A large, gnarled cottonwood tree stood beside it like a silent, ancient guardian. The place looked abandoned, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. The front door, made of heavy sun-bleached wood, was slightly ajar. It creaked open with a sound like a suffering soul as Elena pushed it, the noise echoing in the profound silence. She hesitated on the threshold, peering into the darkness within. The air that drifted out was thick with the smell of dust, decay, and the faint, musty scent of mice. It was not welcoming, but it was shelter. "We have to," Elena whispered, more to herself than to her grandmother. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside, pulling Sewell's lead rope with her. The old horse followed without protest, his hooves making soft, thudding sounds on the dusty wooden floorboards. Anna came in behind them, and Elena gently pushed the heavy door closed. The last of the twilight was shut out, plunging them into near total darkness. For a moment, the blackness was absolute, terrifying. But then as their eyes adjusted, faint moonlight began to filter through the green-caked windows, painting the interior in ghostly shades of silver and gray. They were in a large, single room. Furniture, draped in what looked like white sheets, stood like pale ghosts in the gloom. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its gaping maw filled with cobwebs. Elena felt a strange sensation, a feeling that wasn't fear or despair. It was a tiny, fragile spark of something else. Relief. They were out of the wind. They were hidden. They were safe, at least for the night. The first morning in the abandoned house dawned slowly, the light seeping through the dirty windows like honey. Elena had slept fitfully on a dusty mattress in what appeared to be a small bedroom, her grandmother bundled in the only blanket they had, sleeping in an old armchair in the main room. Sewell had spent the night in the corner of the main room, a quiet, reassuring presence. Elena's first priority was water. She explored the small kitchen at the back of the house. It was a time capsule. A thick layer of dust covered everything. An old wood-burning stove stood cold and silent. In the pantry, she found a treasure trove of ancient supplies, sacks of hardened rice and beans, tins of unidentifiable food, and jars of what might have once been preserves. Most of it was likely inedible, but it was a sign that someone had once planned to live here, to survive here. Her search for water led her outside. Behind the house, half hidden by overgrown weeds, she found it, a stone well with a wooden crank handle. With trembling hands, she lowered the bucket, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. The rope seemed to go down forever, but then she heard a faint splash. She cranked the handle, her muscles straining. The bucket that emerged was filled with clear, clean water. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She drank deeply. the cool water a balm to her parched throat. She carried bucket after bucket back to the house, filling an old basin she had found in the kitchen. They had water. They could survive. That small victory ignited a fire within her. She would not just survive in this house. She would make it a home. She and Anna spent the rest of the day in a flurry of activity. They pulled the dusty sheets off the furniture, revealing simple, sturdy wooden pieces. A large table, a few chairs, a solid-looking bed frame. They swept the thick layers of dust and mouse droppings out the door. The work was hard and dirty, but it was purposeful. It was an act of defiance against the despair that had threatened to swallow them whole. As Elena swept the hearth of the great stone fireplace, she noticed something odd. One of the bricks along the side seemed loose, set slightly differently from the others. Curiosity piqued. She pried at it with her fingers. It wiggled. With a little more effort, it came free, revealing a dark rectangular cavity behind it. Her heart began to beat faster. What was this? A secret? Reaching into the dark space, her fingers brushed against something solid and wooden. She pulled it out. It was a small wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, its surface covered in a thick layer of soot and grime. The latch was rusted shut. For a wild moment, she imagined it was filled with gold or money, a hidden fortune that would solve all their problems. She carried the box to the main table where Anna was carefully wiping down the surface with a damp rag. "Abuela, look what I found." Anna's eyes widened. Together they worked at the rusted latch, using a small piece of metal Elena had found. With a final protesting groan, it sprang open. There was no gold. There was no money. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a bundle of old letters, tied with a brittle, faded blue ribbon, and a small, leather-bound diary. A wave of disappointment washed over Elena, but it was quickly replaced by a deeper curiosity. Who had hidden these things, and why? She carefully untied the ribbon, the silk disintegrating in her fingers. The letters were written in a delicate looping script on brittle, yellowed paper. She picked up the one on top. "My dearest Arturo," she read aloud, her voice hushed. Anna gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Arturo? That was your grandfather's name." A shiver ran down Elena's spine. They sat at the dusty table, the late afternoon sun slanting through the window, and began to read. The letters were from a woman named Isabella. She wrote to Arturo with a passion and intimacy that was both beautiful and shocking. She wrote of shared secrets, of stolen moments, of a love that was deep and true, but clearly forbidden. "I watch you from my window as you work the fields," Elena read from one letter. "You are so strong, my love, but I see the sadness in your eyes. Your wife is a good woman, I know, but she does not see the poet in your soul. I do." Anna listened, her face a mixture of shock and a strange, quiet sorrow. "My Arturo," she whispered, "a whole life together, and I knew nothing of this." There was no anger in her voice, only a profound sense of loss for a part of her husband she had never known. The letters revealed the story. Isabella had been a migrant worker, hired to help on the ranch when Arturo's father was still alive. Arturo had fallen ill with a fever, and Isabella had nursed him back to health. In those long, quiet days, their secret love had blossomed. Then came the letter that changed everything. "My love, my Arturo," Elena read, her voice trembling. "I carry a part of you with me now, a new life, our son." A son. Her grandfather had another child, a brother to her mother, Sophia. The implications were staggering, but where was this woman? Where was this child? The answer lay in the small leather diary. Elena opened it carefully. The same delicate script filled its pages. Isabella's diary was a record of her hopes and fears. It revealed that Arturo, trapped in his duty to his family and his wife, had done what he could for her. He had built this very house for her, this secret sanctuary in the desert where she could live in peace and raise their child. He calls it our castle, one entry read, a fortress of love against a cruel world. Here we will be safe. Here, our son, Miguel, will grow up strong. Miguel, that was his name. As they read on, the story turned tragic. Arturo's family grew suspicious. Threats were made. Isabella wrote of her terror, of her fear for her son's safety. The final entries were frantic, desperate. "We must flee," Elena read, her throat tight. "Arturo's brothers have found us. They have threatened to take my boy. We are leaving tonight. I do not know where we will go. I will leave this here, in our secret place, in the hope that one day my son can return to his home, to his birthright." Birthright. The word hung in the air. As Elena closed the diary, she felt something slide inside the back cover. She pried it open and found a hidden compartment. Tucked inside was a folded, official-looking document. Her hands shaking, she unfolded it. It was a property deed, the deed to this house, this land. And the name on the deed was not Arturo. It was Miguel, his son. The ground seemed to shift beneath Elena's feet. This was not just an abandoned shack. This was their family's history. This was her uncle's home. The villains, her other uncles, Luis and Jorge, had no claim to this place. This refuge, which they had stumbled upon by chance, was in a way rightfully theirs, a legacy of a secret love. Tears streamed down Elena's face, not of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming sense of connection, of destiny. She looked at Ana, whose own eyes were shining. "Abuela," she breathed, "we're home." But their moment of revelation was shattered by a sound from outside, the distinct menacing rumble of an engine growing closer. Headlights cut through the twilight, sweeping across the front of the house and illuminating the dusty room in a harsh, interrogating glare. Fear, cold and sharp, stabbed through Elena. She knew that sound. It was Luis's truck. They had found them. How? The chimney. They had lit a small fire earlier to boil water. The smoke had been a beacon, leading the wolves right to their door. "Quickly!" Ana hissed, her frailty vanishing, replaced by a primal instinct to survive. "The bedroom! Blow out the candle!" Elena scrambled to obey, her heart hammering against her ribs. She blew out the single candle, plunging the room back into darkness, and grabbed the precious wooden box. She helped her grandmother into the small back bedroom, herding the ever-calm soul in with them. She closed the door as quietly as she could, just as the sound of heavy footsteps crunched on the ground outside. They stood in the pitch-black room, holding their breath, listening to the monsters who had come to finish what they had started. The front door burst open with a splintering crash, the sound of violence echoing through the small house. "I know you're in here," Luis's voice roared, laced with a deranged fury. "I saw the smoke. You can't hide from me." Elena stood frozen in the darkness of the bedroom, clutching the wooden box to her chest. Her grandmother's hand found hers, a small bird-like grip that trembled but was also strangely strong. Sul shifted beside them, letting out a low, nervous whicker. The thin wooden door felt like a piece of paper against the rage that was filling their sanctuary. "Come on out, you little thief," Luis bellowed. "Thinking you can run away? Thinking you can hide in some desert shack?" Heavy footsteps stomped through the main room, accompanied by the sound of things being thrown, of furniture being overturned. It was the sound of chaos, of a man consumed by his own poison. Elena knew they couldn't stay hidden. He would tear the house apart until he found them. The thought of him laying a hand on her grandmother ignited a fire in her belly, a rage that burned hotter than her fear. She had been a victim for too long, no more. Taking a deep breath, she squeezed Anna's hand, a silent promise. Then she opened the bedroom door and stepped out into the moonlit main room. Luis was standing in the center of the room, a whirlwind of destruction. He spun around as she emerged, his eyes wild and bloodshot. Jorge hovered near the broken doorway, his face pale and slick with sweat, looking like a frightened jackal. "There you are," Luis snarled, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He took a step toward her, his posture menacing. "What's this all about, eh? Found yourself a new little hovel to squat in? Did you think I wouldn't find you?" "This isn't your concern, Luis," Elena said, her voice shaking but steady. "Leave us alone." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Leave you alone? You're my concern. You, that old woman, everything you have is my concern. You think I went to all that trouble just to let you disappear?" He lunged forward and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "Where is it? Where's the money our mother supposedly left you? I know she had some tucked away." Pain shot up Elena's arm, but it was the sight of her grandmother stepping out of the bedroom behind her, her face a mask of fierce maternal anger that broke the dam of Elena's control. "Don't you dare touch her!" Elena screamed, her voice ripping from her throat with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She tried to pull her arm away, but his grip was like iron. "You listen to me, you ungrateful brat," Luis began, raising his other hand as if to strike her. Suddenly the entire scene was frozen by a blinding beam of light that shot through the open doorway, pinning them all like insects on a board. A deep, calm voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" Everyone turned toward the source of the light. A tall figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, a powerful flashlight held in one hand. He was dressed in simple work clothes, jeans and a heavy shirt, but he carried an aura of quiet, unshakable authority. His face was in shadow, but his presence filled the room, instantly shifting the balance of power. Luis immediately released Elena's arm, stepping back as if burned. His aggression evaporated, replaced by a defensive bluster. "Who the hell are you? This is a private matter." The stranger took a step into the room, his boots making a solid, confident sound on the floorboards. He swept the beam of his flashlight over Luis and Jorge, then let it rest on Elena and Anna. "Everything okay here, ma'am?" he asked, his voice directed at Anna, respectful and calm. "No, sir, it is not," Anna said, her voice trembling but firm. "These men are my sons, and they are trespassing. They have threatened my granddaughter." The stranger's light moved back to Luis. "I live just over that rise," he said, his tone casual, but with an underlying edge of steel. "Saw your truck tear up the road. Then I heard shouting. Around here, we tend to look out for our neighbors, especially when they're two defenseless women." He took another step forward. "I know your family. I know your reputation in town, Luis. I suggest you and your brother get back in your truck and leave." Was there a spark of humanity left in him? For a moment, Luis seemed to weigh his options, his eyes darting from the stranger to Elena, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. But something in the stranger's unyielding stance, in his quiet confidence, made the bully in Luis falter. He was a coward at heart, only brave when his victims were weaker than him. "This isn't over," Luis spat, his voice a venomous whisper. He pointed a shaking finger at Elena. You will pay for this." He grabbed Jorge by the arm, practically dragging his whimpering brother out of the house and back into the night. The sound of their truck engine roaring to life, followed by the squeal of tires on dirt, was a symphony of retreat. Silence descended on the room, broken only by the sound of their own ragged breathing. The stranger lowered his flashlight, and in the softer ambient light, Elena finally saw his face. He looked to be in his late 40s, with a rugged, weathered face, kind eyes, and dark hair graying at the temples. There was a deep sadness in his expression, but also an immense strength. "Thank you," Elena breathed, her legs suddenly feeling weak. You saved us." "My name is David," he said, giving them a small, reassuring nod. "I saw the smoke from your chimney this afternoon. Figured someone had finally moved into the old Isabella place." Elena's head snapped up. "Isabella? You knew her?" A shadow passed over David's face. "Not really. I was very young when we left. She was my mother." He looked around the dusty, ransacked room with a profound sense of melancholy. She used to talk about this house. She called it her castle. The words from the diary. Her castle. Elena's heart felt like it was going to burst. Her hands shaking, she held out the wooden box. "My mother's name was Sophia. Her father was Arturo." David's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief, of dawning recognition in their depths. He took the box from her, his calloused fingers tracing the worn wood as if it were a sacred relic. Elena showed him the letters, the diary. He stared at the delicate looping script, his expression unreadable. "Her handwriting," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I haven't seen it since I was a boy." He looked from the letters to Elena, and then to Anna. He was connecting the pieces, the secret history of a family torn apart by duty and fear. He was realizing that the old woman standing before him was the wife of the father he never knew. "My God," he said, sinking onto one of the dusty chairs. "She protected me from this past. She changed our names, moved us 100 miles away. She never wanted me to know the danger we were in, the family we left behind." Anna stepped forward, her face etched with a wisdom that transcended jealousy or old wounds. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are my husband's son," she said, her voice clear and certain. "You have his eyes. You are blood of my blood." David looked up at her, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. In that moment, the decades of secrets and sorrow dissolved. They were not strangers. They were family. He, David, was Miguel, the rightful owner of this house, the half-brother of Elena's mother, her uncle, a real uncle, not like the monsters who had just fled into the night. Elena showed him the deed, the name Miguel, clearly written on it. He stared at it, the legal proof of the life his mother had been forced to abandon. A fierce, protective light entered his eyes. He stood up, his sorrow replaced by a steely resolve. He looked at Elena, then at Anna. "You are not alone," he said, his voice a solemn vow. "Not anymore. This is my house, and my house is your house. Those men, my half-brothers, they will never bother you again, I swear it." The alliance was formed. In the dusty ruins of a forgotten love story, a new family had been forged, bound by blood and a shared history. For the first time since her mother's death, Elena felt a true, solid glimmer of hope. They were no longer just surviving. They were preparing to fight back. The transformation began the very next morning. David arrived not in a dusty pickup, but in a sturdy flatbed truck loaded with supplies. It was like watching a rescue mission unfold. He brought a generator, and with a roar, the little adobe house had power for the first time in decades. Light bulbs flickered on, casting a warm yellow glow that chased the last of the shadows from the corners. He brought food, not just sacks of beans and rice, but fresh bread, eggs, cheese, and milk. He brought a small propane stove, and soon the air was filled with the smell of coffee and frying bacon, aromas of normalcy and comfort that felt impossibly luxurious. For Sul, he brought bags of sweet feed and bales of rich alfalfa hay, a feast for the old horse who had carried their hopes so patiently. But David brought more than just supplies. He brought a sense of purpose. Together, the three of them, a new, strange, and yet perfectly formed family, set to work. The physical labor was a balm for their wounded spirits. David, with his quiet competence, showed Elena how to board up the broken front door, how to replace the cracked window panes, how to patch the holes in the roof. Her hands, once soft, quickly became calloused and capable. She learned the satisfying heft of a hammer, the precise art of sawing a straight line. With every nail driven, with every patch applied, the house became less of a ruin and more of a fortress. It was their fortress, David's by law, but theirs by heart. The act of building and repairing mirrored the healing that was happening inside them. The house was shedding its skin of neglect, and so were they. In the evenings they would sit by the fire in the great stone hearth, the flames dancing and casting warm shadows on the adobe walls. They would talk for hours. Anna, her memory surprisingly sharp, would share stories of a younger Arturo, painting a picture of a man who was kind and gentle, but also haunted by a sadness she had never understood until now. David, in turn, would share fragmented memories of his mother, Isabella, a resilient and loving woman who had shielded him from a painful past at great personal cost. Elena listened, absorbing the stories, weaving together the torn threads of her family's history. She was no longer just the daughter of Sofia. She was the granddaughter of Arturo and Anna, the niece of the brave Isabella, and the niece of this quiet, strong man who had appeared in their darkest hour like an answer to a prayer they hadn't dared to voice. After a week of fortification and healing, David announced the next step. "It's time to make it official," he said, his jaw set with determination. "Tomorrow we go to the county records office in Las Cruces." The trip felt momentous. Elena, Anna, and David drove into the city, the precious wooden box sitting on the seat between them. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit government building, David laid out their case. He presented the deed with his birth name, Miguel, on it. He presented his own birth certificate and the legal documents showing his name change to David. He presented Isabella's diary as corroborating evidence. And finally, Anna, with unshakable dignity, gave a sworn statement confirming that she knew her husband had a son and that she recognized this man as that son. The clerk, a woman with tired eyes, listened to their story with a growing sense of astonishment. She examined the documents, checked them against the old county maps and ledgers. After what felt like an eternity, she looked up and nodded. "The deed is valid," she said simply. "The property at this location is registered to a Mr. Miguel. Now, David, it's yours, free and clear." Victory. It was a clean, legal, undeniable victory. Walking out of the building and into the bright sunlight, Elena felt 10 feet tall. The first battle had been won. "Now," David said, a grim smile on his face, "let's go visit my brothers." They drove not back to the desert, but to the house Elena had been thrown out of. Her heart hammered in her chest as they pulled up to the familiar porch. Luis's truck was parked outside. The door opened before they even got out of the car. Luis stood there, his face a mask of arrogant disbelief. "What do you want?" he snarled, David walked calmly up the path, Elena and Anna a few steps behind him. He stopped at the foot of the porch, looking up at the man who was his half-brother. "My name is David," he began, his voice even. "But I was born Miguel. My mother was Isabella. My father was Arturo." The color drained from Luis's face. He stared at David, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. Jorge appeared behind him, his eyes wide with panic. "My father didn't have other children." Luis finally managed to stammer, a desperate denial. "He did," David said flatly. "And he provided for us. He built a house for my mother and me on his land, the same house you broke into last week, the same house that is and always has been, legally mine." He held up a copy of the newly certified title. "This game you're playing is over, Luis. You have no claim on me, on my property, or on this family." Luis's denial curdled into pure, sputtering rage. "Get off my property," he screamed, his voice cracking. "You're a liar, a fraud. I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," David said calmly. True to his word, Luis disappeared inside, and a few minutes later the wail of a siren grew closer. A county sheriff's car pulled up. A weary-looking officer stepped out, his hand resting on his hip. "What's the trouble here, Luis? You call me out here, it had better be important." "Officer, thank God," Luis said, his voice dripping with false victimhood. "This man is trespassing. He's trying to defraud me, and he's brought these two with him." He gestured contemptuously at Elena and Anna. The officer listened patiently, then turned to David. "Son, what's your side of the story?" David calmly explained who he was and presented the officer with the certified deed to the adobe house. He explained that Luis and Jorge had trespassed on his property and threatened his family. The officer took the documents, read them carefully, and then looked at Luis with an expression of profound annoyance. "Luis, this document is legal and binding. This man owns the property out on the mesa. It sounds to me like you were the one trespassing, not him." He handed the papers back to David. "As for this house," he said, gesturing to the home they stood in front of, "the paperwork you filed looks suspicious as hell, and after this little stunt, you can bet I'm going to have the county attorney look into it. Now, if I have to come out here again because you're harassing these people, I'll arrest you for misuse of police resources. Do you understand me?" Humiliation and fury warred on Luis's face. He was speechless. Jorge, standing behind him, began to tremble visibly. The foundation of his brother's authority was cracking, and Jorge was terrified of what would happen when it crumbled completely. Defeated, Luis could only watch as David, Elena, and Anna calmly walked back to their truck and drove away. If this story has moved you so far, if you have felt Elena's anguish and Anna's strength, leave a like and stay until the end, because what comes now is even more exciting. On the drive back to their fortress in the desert, a sense of profound peace settled over Elena. They had faced the monster, and he had been forced to retreat. But there was one last ghost to exorcise, one final toxic tie to her past that needed to be cut. "David," she said quietly, "there's one more stop I need to make, alone." He looked at her, saw the resolve in her eyes, and simply nodded. He drove her to a small, neat suburban house in a newer part of town, and waited in the truck as she walked to the door. Her heart was calm. This was not about revenge or recrimination. This was about closure. Marco himself answered the door. His handsome face registered shock, then a flicker of guilt. "Elena," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "What are you doing here?" I just came to tell you something, Marco, she said, her voice even and strong. I wanted you to know that I was pregnant with your son, and I wanted you to know that I lost him, and when my world fell apart, when I needed help, you were nowhere to be found. He flinched, the words hitting their mark. Elena, I'm sorry, he stammered, fumbling for an excuse. He looked panicked, reaching for his wallet. Look, I can give you some money. She held up a hand, stopping him. I don't want your money, Marco. I don't want anything from you. I just wanted to tell you the truth. And I wanted you to know that help did arrive. A family I never knew I had found me. I'm not alone, and I'm not weak. She looked him directly in the eye, all the old pain and love she had felt for him gone, replaced by a calm, clear-eyed pity. Goodbye, Marco. She turned and walked away without a backward glance, leaving him standing in his doorway, a ghost from a life she had now fully left behind. When she got back in the truck, she took a deep breath and looked at the long road stretching back toward the desert. Let's go home, she said to David, and for the first time, the word felt completely, unequivocally true. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm established itself at the adobe house. The bond between Elena and David deepened, forged in the shared work of rebuilding. They worked side by side every day, their hands often brushing, their gazes lingering for a moment longer than necessary. She saw in him a quiet strength and a deep well of kindness that was utterly alien to the men she had known before. He wasn't like her uncles, who took by force, or like Marco, who ran from responsibility. David was a builder, a protector. He looked at her not as a conquest or a burden, but with a profound respect that made her feel seen for the first time in her life. One afternoon, as David returned from his own small ranch nearby, a disturbed look was on his face. That's strange, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He was staring at the small tool shed he had erected near the house. The lock on the shed has been tampered with. He checked inside. Nothing of value seemed to be missing. Tools were all there. Equipment was accounted for. But then his eyes fell on an empty space in the corner. My spare gas can, he said, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. It's gone. A dark premonition, cold and sharp, pierced the peaceful bubble they had built around themselves. Why would someone steal a can of gasoline? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken, terrifying possibilities. The war was not over. The final battle was yet to come. The premonition became a certainty the next evening. David received a call from an old friend who lived on the other side of Las Cruces, a man who kept an ear to the ground. His friend's voice was urgent. David, you need to be careful. I overheard something in a bar. It was Jorge, your brother. He was drunk, crying, said Luis was going crazy, talking about how if he couldn't have the family land, no one would. He was talking about fire. The words hit David like a physical blow. Fire. The stolen gas can. It all clicked into place, with horrifying clarity. Luis wasn't just going to fight them with lawyers or intimidation anymore. He was going to erase the problem. He was going to burn the house to the ground, destroying the evidence, the history, and the family within it. Elena! David's voice was a raw shout as he ran from his truck toward the house. Get out! Get out of the house now! He's coming! Panic, cold and absolute, seized Elena. She didn't question him. She grabbed Ana, who was dozing by the fire, her mind instantly alert. Abuela, we have to go. Now! They scrambled out of the house, Elena practically carrying her grandmother. She grabbed Sul's lead rope, her mind racing. The road. They had to get to the main road. But as they cleared the cottonwood tree, her blood ran cold. Headlights were approaching, not from the road, but cutting across the open desert, bouncing wildly over the rough terrain, a direct, brutal approach. They were cutting off their escape. Luis's truck slid to a stop 20 yards from the house, blocking their path. He leaped out, his face a grotesque mask of insane rage. In his hand, he held the red gasoline can. Jorge stumbled out of the passenger side, his face a mess of tears and terror. "Luis, no, please don't do this," he sobbed. Luis ignored him, his eyes fixed on the adobe house, the object of all his hatred. "This house," he hissed, his voice a low, guttural growl. "Everything is because of this house. It poisoned my father. It brought you here. If the house disappears, the problem disappears." Anna stepped forward, her small frame trembling, but her voice ringing with maternal authority. "Luis, for the love of God, stop. I am your mother. You stopped being my mother when you chose them over me," he shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Elena and David, who was now running toward them from his own truck. "You always chose Sophia, and now you choose her brat and this bastard." He ran to the house, unscrewing the cap of the gas can. He began to splash the gasoline onto the dry adobe wall, the fumes instantly filling the air with a sickening stench. Jorge fell to his knees, pleading, "Please, brother, it's our family history. It's Mama's home." "It's not a home. It's a curse," Luis screamed. He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a lighter. At that exact moment, David reached him. With a roar of pure fury, he launched himself at Luis, tackling him to the ground, just as Luis flicked the lighter. The small flame flew through the air in a perfect arc, landing on the gasoline-soaked wall. The world erupted in a whoosh of fire. A wall of orange and yellow flame shot up the side of the house, devouring the dry wood of the window frames and licking at the eaves of the roof. David and Luis were wrestling on the ground, a desperate, violent struggle. Elena, Anna, and Jorge could only watch in horror as the flames grew, crackling and roaring like a hungry beast. The house, their sanctuary, their home, was being consumed. And then a horrifying thought struck Elena, a thought that eclipsed everything else. The box, Isabella's letters, the diary, the proof of their history, the foundation of their new family. It was still inside, on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. Without a second thought, she ran. "Elena, no!" David screamed, seeing her sprint toward the burning building. She didn't listen. Adrenaline surged through her, overriding all sense of self-preservation. She pulled the collar of her shirt up over her nose and mouth and plunged through the doorway into a hell of smoke and heat. Inside, the smoke was a thick, choking blanket. Her eyes streamed, and every breath was agony. The fire was spreading with terrifying speed across the ceiling. She could hear the roar of it all around her. Through the swirling black smoke, she saw it. The wooden box, silhouetted against the flames that were now starting to creep down the far wall. She scrambled toward the fireplace, grabbed the box. It was hot to the touch, and clutched it to her chest. She turned to run back, but a loud crack echoed above her. She looked up in terror to see a massive ceiling beam, charred and glowing, break free. It fell with a deafening crash, landing between her and the doorway, blocking her escape and showering the room with a deadly rain of sparks and embers. She was trapped. Panic gave way to a primal terror. She was going to die, here, in this house that had promised her a new life. She screamed, a sound swallowed by the roar of the fire. Suddenly a figure burst through the smoke. It was David. He had a wet cloth tied around his face. "Elena!" he yelled, his eyes wild with fear. He saw the fallen beam. There was no way through. He looked around desperately and saw that the fire had eaten a hole through the back wall of the house. "This way!" he shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the new opening. They scrambled through the jagged, smoldering hole in the adobe wall just as the main section of the roof gave way behind them. With a great, groaning sigh, collapsing into the heart of the house in a volcanic eruption of flames and smoke, they fell to the ground outside, coughing and gasping for air, their faces black with soot. They were alive. Elena looked down at her hands. She was still clutching the box. It was charred and blackened, but it was intact. She'd saved their story from the flames. As they lay there, catching their breath, a new sound cut through the night. The high, piercing wail of sirens. Red and blue lights flashed across the desert landscape, growing brighter and brighter. David had called them. He had known what Luis was capable of. Police cars and a fire truck screeched to a halt. Officers swarmed the scene. One group rushed to contain the fire, while another went straight for Luis, who was now sitting on the ground, defeated, the fight gone out of him. They pulled him to his feet and snapped handcuffs on his wrists. He didn't resist. He just stared at the fire, his expression vacant, a man who had burned down his own soul. Jorge, sobbing uncontrollably, rushed toward the nearest officer. "It was him!" he cried, pointing at his brother. "I tried to stop him. He wanted to kill them. He told me he was going to do it. I'll tell you everything, everything." The fight was over. Justice had arrived, its lights flashing in the terrible, beautiful glow of the fire. The house was gone, a smoldering ruin against the dark sky, but they were alive, they were together, and in Elena's arms they held the one thing that could never be burned, the truth. The fire department managed to save the outer adobe walls, but the interior of the house was a blackened, smoking ruin. The roof was gone, the furniture reduced to ash. Their sanctuary was a skeleton, open to the starry desert sky. Standing in the flashing emergency lights, wrapped in blankets provided by a paramedic, Elena looked at the devastation and felt not despair, but a strange sense of peace. The house was just a building. The home, she realized, was the people standing beside her. David put a comforting arm around her shoulders. His own small ranch was a few miles away. "My house is too big for one man," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion and smoke. "It's nothing fancy, but it's warm and safe. Come live with me, not as guests, as family." Elena looked at Anna, who nodded, her eyes full of gratitude. She looked at David, this man who had charged into a burning building for her. She accepted his offer not as an act of pity, but as a statement of belonging. That night, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she and her grandmother slept in clean, soft beds, in a house where the doors were locked against the world, and they were utterly, completely safe. The legal resolution was swift and decisive. With Jorge's tearful, detailed testimony against his brother, the case was airtight. A lawyer David hired took on their civil case. The fraudulent property transfer Luis had engineered was annulled by a judge. The house in Las Cruces, the home of Elena's childhood, was officially returned to Anna's name. For a moment, Elena thought they might move back, but when she brought it up, Anna shook her head. "No, mija," she said, looking out the window of David's ranch house toward the distant mesa. "That house is full of bad memories now, of their greed. This land, this is where Arturo's heart was. This is where Isabella's spirit rests. This is where I want to be." They made a decision. They would sell the house in the city, and with the money, they would rebuild. The trial of Luis was a somber affair. Elena and Anna sat in the front row, a united front. Jorge, granted immunity for his testimony, recounted the weeks of his brother's escalating rage and paranoia. He wept on the stand as he described the night of the fire. But the most devastating testimony came from Ana. She took the stand, a small, frail woman in a simple black dress, and spoke with a quiet, heartbreaking dignity. She looked directly at her son, the man sitting at the defendant's table. "That man is not my son," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing through the silent courtroom. "My son Luis died a long time ago, and he was replaced by a creature made of greed and hate. The man who set fire to our history, who tried to kill his own family. He is a stranger to me." The judge, a stern man with compassionate eyes, delivered the sentence. For attempted murder, arson, and fraud, Luis was sentenced to 25 years in a state penitentiary with no possibility of parole. "You violated the most sacred of bonds," the judge said, his voice filled with contempt, "that of a son to his mother. You are a disgrace to your father's name." As Luis was led away in handcuffs, his face pale and empty, Elena felt no triumph, only a sad, quiet finality. The poison had been purged, justice had been served, the rebuilding began. With the funds from the sale of the city house and David's expertise, a new adobe house began to rise from the ashes of the old one. It was a mirror of the original in its traditional form, but stronger, better. David hired a team of local craftsmen, men who knew the old ways of working with earth and wood. Elena, however, refused to be a bystander. She became the project manager, a title that at first felt foreign but soon fit her like a glove. She learned about foundations and framing, about plumbing and electrical work. Her hands grew stronger, her skin tanned by the sun. She discovered a resilience and a capability within herself that she never knew existed. She was no longer a victim of her circumstances. She was the architect of her future. Sul, the old lame horse who had led them to this place, spent his days grazing happily in a new, lush pasture David had built for him, a quiet patriarch watching over their rebirth. As the house grew, so did the love between Elena and David. It was a love built not on fleeting passion, but on a foundation of mutual respect, shared struggle, and deep, quiet understanding. It was in the way he'd bring her a cup of coffee in the morning without being asked, the way she knew exactly which tool he needed before he said a word. It was in the long, comfortable silences they could share, watching the sunset paint the desert sky. One evening, after the last of the workers had gone home, they stood in the nearly completed living room, the scent of fresh plaster and pine in the air. The desert sky outside the new, large window was a breathtaking tapestry of stars. David turned to her, his expression serious. He took both of her hands in his. "Elena," he began, his voice soft. "When I met you, I was a man living in the past, haunted by a mother I lost and a father I never knew. You gave me back my father's history. You gave me a family. You gave me a future." He reached into his pocket, but he didn't pull out a velvet box with a diamond ring. He pulled out a simple, humble ring he had woven himself from a piece of twine taken from Anna's new garden. "You have rebuilt this house," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Now help me build a life. Marry me, Elena." Tears streamed down Elena's face, but for the first time in her life, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. After a lifetime in a storm, she was finally home. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Years passed. The adobe house on the mesa became a true home, filled with warmth and laughter. Elena and David's partnership flourished, not just in love, but in business. They started a small, successful equestrian center, specializing in therapeutic riding for children with disabilities, a tribute to the gentle, patient spirit of Old Soul. They had 2 children of their own, a boy with David's kind eyes, and a girl with Elena's fierce spirit. Anna lived to the ripe old age of 92, long enough to see her great-grandchildren take their first steps on the land her husband had loved. She passed away peacefully in her sleep, in her own bed, surrounded by a family that adored her. On the mantelpiece of the new fireplace, in the exact spot where it had been before the fire, sat the charred wooden box. It was no longer a container of secrets, but a proud symbol of their foundation, a reminder of the love that started it all and the resilience that saw them through the flames. One evening, many years later, Elena and David, now with gray in their own hair, stood on their porch, watching their grandchildren play in the yard under the watchful eye of the ancient cottonwood tree. They had created a small fund in Anna's and Isabella's names, a charity to help other families who found themselves cast out and in hardship. The cycle of cruelty they had endured had been broken, replaced by a cycle of kindness. The long, desolate road that had once seemed so threatening had in the end led them home. The cruelest betrayals had led to the deepest love. The fire that was meant to destroy them had only served to purify them, burning away the past and revealing the strong, true core of family that lay beneath. Their house was more than just a home. It was a testament, built from ashes, to the incredible, unyielding resilience of the human spirit. What did you think of Elena's journey from the depths of despair to the heights of happiness? This story teaches us that even when we are cast out into the desert of our lives, stripped of everything we hold dear, we can find an oasis of hope. It reminds us that family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we build through love, loyalty, and shared struggle. The cruelest endings can sometimes be the start of the most beautiful new beginnings. If you believe in the strength of family and the power of new beginnings, comment with the word resilience. Your engagement helps us bring more stories like this to people who need to hear them. We appreciate you spending this time with us. Thank you for listening to this incredible story of survival and rebirth. We hope it has touched your heart and inspired you. Every story we share is a testament to the strength of the human spirit against all odds. If you enjoyed this journey, please leave your like and subscribe to our channel to see more touching stories like this one. Your support allows us to continue creating content that moves and inspires. We look forward to sharing our next story with you. Until then, remember that even after the fiercest fire, new life can and will grow.